I'm going to introduce Peter in a minute, formally. Before we do that, we have a couple of small rules. One is if you could, with the exception of Pete and the speaker and myself, could you turn your videos off and also mute your mics? This helps both with the recording and also the quality of the record we make of the talk when people want to watch it. People are doing other things, it's distracting. So if you could turn your video off, except for Pete, Marion and others, and mute your mic, that will be very welcome. Thank you. Assuming you can still hear me, the rules are we'll allow Pete to speak for about 40 minutes. If there's really desperate need to interrupt or explain, Peter may wish to accept that. But normally, please raise your hands. I mean, your virtual hand, your yellow hand with the hand raise icon, which is at the top of the screen. And I shall try and be fair and take people in order for questions. I'm sure that'll be a great discussion today. So it's a great honor and pleasure to invite Pete Richerson to this meeting. Pete, you don't need much of an introduction. Everybody knows you're one of the pioneers of dual inheritance theory, with joint works, particularly with Robert Boyd, including the classic 1985 volume, which really moved things forward in this area, in evolutionary anthropology and cultural evolution. And I've always followed your work and I've always found it hugely inspiring. It's a great pleasure and honor to have you today. But I want to listen to what you've got to say, so I shall shut up and over to you, Pete.
Okay, thank you very much, Jeff. So I would title this talk, A Brief History of Cultural Evolution, How Darwin's Ideas Were Neglected for 3/4 of a Century. This has always intrigued me. As Jeff mentioned, Rob and I wrote that 85 book, which is fairly influential. And I just wondered all my career how we got away with this. How come Cavalli, Swartzen, Feldman, and I, and the others, Rob and I, and the others who got in kind of on the ground floor, that there was so much to do. There was so much low-hanging fruit. It was kind of a died and gone to heaven moment. But why hadn't the social science, the human sciences more generally, kept up with developments in evolutionary biology over the first 3/4 or so of the 20th century? How were we so lucky as to find so much low-hanging fruit? It has always interested me why we got so lucky, and so this is a sort of my thoughts on that. So I want to start with Darwin and the descent of man, and the argument I want to make is that Darwin was a pretty sophisticated about cultural evolution, and in the descent of man particularly, he laid out a program of research which a number of people in the 19th century actually took up. So he was influential, but then around the turn of the century, the Darwinian thread got dropped, and Darwin is not appreciated as one of the founding fathers of the social sciences, for example, although in my estimation, that's an oversight. So the reason that Darwin had a fairly sophisticated appreciation of cultural evolution is that he's a natural historian, right? And so things that are observable are things that he can get his hands and mind around. And so he was a devoted family man, had a pile of kids, and was, by all accounts, the Darwin family was close. And Darwin, when his first son was born, he kept a detailed diary of the child's development for the first year or two of his life, which much later was published as a biographical sketch on an infant. So he did some close observation of child development, and things like imitation were easy to appreciate. He had a much less sophisticated appreciation of organic inheritance because the processes of organic inheritance are not really available to an ordinary natural historian. The essential processes are hidden in a way that cultural transmission isn't. Cultural transmission is out in the open, and uh, and biological transmission, genetic transmission is hidden in the bedroom, so to speak. So it took Mendelian experiments. Essentially, after Darwin was gone, no one paid any attention to Mendel in the day. So Darwin was dead by the time Mendelism was rediscovered, and we had some kind of handle on genes. But of course, we really couldn't observe genes until quite recently, when nowadays we have cheap gene sequencing, and we can observe genes fine. And Darwin made what biologists came to think of as errors. He thought the inheritance of acquired variation was important in biological inheritance. He had a distinction between cultural and biological inheritance, but the distinction was blurred by the fact that he thought that the inheritance of acquired variation, obviously important in cultural systems, was important in biological inheritance as well. And he makes a stout defense of this in the preface to the second edition of the Descent of Man. So you might think that Darwin's theory of organic inheritance was basically modeled on culture, the system of inheritance that he understood fairly well. And he had a gemmules theory of how gemmules were these little particles that were shed by all of the tissues of the body and collected in the gonads to make the gametes. And this was how mechanistically you could imagine a system for the inheritance of acquired variation would work. But he cheerfully admitted that this was completely speculative, and he had no real evidence for it at all. It was not a real satisfactory theory. Now, to my way of thinking, it's hard to read The Descent of Man without taking advantage of the scholarship of several people who, at least the ones I read, that dissected what Darwin was trying to get at. The confusion over, I mean, you can't. Darwin didn't think in genes versus culture because he didn't know anything about genes, and to the extent that he knew anything about organic inheritance, it was scrambled. So I read The Descent of Man early on in my career, and I couldn't make much out of it. There's a bunch of stuff in there that seems kind of wild. So later on, I read Howard Gruber's book on Darwin as a psychologist, and Robert Richards wrote a book that influenced me quite a bit, and Peter Bowler, who pointed out that Darwin had a lot of competitors, and the idea of evolution by natural selection was not, it had to compete with a bunch of other ideas about how evolution worked in the 19th and early 20th century. And Darwin wasn't the overwhelming influence that he became in biology later. Darwin was skeptical about progress, and much of Victorian thought thought that progressive evolution was, or progressive transit evolution were all important. Yet he also proposed a theory of moral progress that I'll go into a little bit later. Another thing that Gruber covered in his book in several pages was Darwin's habit of truckling. This is Darwin's own term. Gruber reports some correspondence in which Darwin, in late in life, was sorry that he'd done this. And what he did was deliberately use a lot of ripe Victorian prose to conceal his materialism. When he was a student at Edinburgh, one of his fellow students gave a talk in a sort of a seminar that was outrageously materialistic in its approach, and he took a huge amount of hazing. So Darwin was always shy about being tarred in public as a materialist. Of course, he was as materialist as he could be through and through, but he took care to try to conceal this fact. And so there's a lot of rhetoric in Darwin that can be attributed at least to his this protective coloration that he tried to wear. And he continued this late into his life, long after he was famous and long after materialism had lost its bite. And you might attribute that to his illness, whatever it was that made him a recluse. He never was as stout about any of his private views as he was in the Voyage of the Beagle. In the Descent of Man, he was much more circumspect about these kinds of things. Oops, what did I do here? Now, Darwin is a very clear writer, so you can almost always piece out what he really was trying to say and work around the truckling, but it's not easy. And sometimes it's just impossible to know whether he really believed some of the things he said or whether it was part of this protective coloration. So the suspicions about progress come from, the first quote here is from the N notebook, which Gruber published with a guy named Barrett. His notebooks, and they discuss these. So this is a quote: "Man's intellect has not become superior to that of the Greeks, which seems opposed to progressive development. There is no, in my theory, there is no absolute tendency to progress excepting from favorable circumstances." So Darwin carried this kind of suspicion about progressive evolution throughout his career, but it was not a popular opinion, along with his more general materialism. But he was, in the Voyage of the Beagle, the second quote here, as I said, he was quite stout there about his hatred of slavery. And this is just a particularly vivid quote that you can read there. He certainly didn't shy away from excoriating Englishmen, Americans, Argentinians. He was in Patagonia during the time when General Rosas was trying to exterminate the by now mounted Native Americans of Patagonia, and he was excoriated the Argentinians for their bloodthirsty approach to Native American affairs, you might say. And so truckling, here's some quotes that I think exemplify the truckling. The first here is a review of the Descent of Man, and in which his materialism is indirectly attacked. The idea that we were just a natural product, the modified faculties of brutes must, earnest-minded men will be compelled to give up those motives by which they have attempted to live noble and virtuous lives. So this was late in his career. He was still being attacked for this kind of materialism. The second quote is from the from the Voyage of the Beagle, and it's a part of a long passage where he describes the lives of the Fuegan natives in the most purple Victorian terms. These poor wretches who were stunted in their growth, etc. Viewing such men, one can hardly make oneself believe that they are the fellow creatures and inhabitants of the same world. Now, this is the longer page or two of this stuff is sandwiched between two observations about what it's like to live in the Straits of Magellan. He penned this in his diary on Christmas Day. So the midsummer in the Terra del Fuego area, and he describes snow on the hills down to nearly to sea level, and he describes it as the most awful climate in the world. And so he speculates about what would have driven people from the more salubrious climates to the north to live in such a benighted place. And the take-home message is that these people are poor wretches, not because they're innately poor wretches, but because they live in the lousiest climate in the world, and they have to make a living there with Stone Age technology. So the argument is not typical Victorian racism, to my way of thinking, but it's part of this truckling business. So more to the point of Darwin's view of the races. In one chapter of The Descent of Man on the races, Darwin goes to a lot of trouble to contradict the argument that the races are different species. This was a plank in the colonialist and slaveholding ideologies that if people can keep cows as domesticated animals, then why can't we keep another species, Africans, as a domesticated animal? And Darwin was keen to argue that as he says here, although the existing races differ in many respects, that they are found to resemble each other closely in a multitude of points. The same remark holds good with equal or greater force with respect to the numerous points of mental similarity between the most distinct races of man. The American Aborigines, Negroes, and Europeans are as different from one another in mind as any three races that can be named. Yet I was constantly struck while living with the Fuegans on board the Beagle with how many little traits of character showing how similar their minds were to ours. And so it was once with a full-blooded Negro that whom I happened once to be intimate with whom I had always imagined that the intimate that Darwin was talking about was perhaps some beautiful Brazilian woman, but it turns out that the guy that he was intimate with was a professional specimen preparer who Darwin worked with, working up the collections that he made on the Voyage of the Beagle. So completely non-scandalous intimacy. Second quote here is just to point out that he made a distinction between organic inheritance and cultural inheritance. He says as it is improbable that numerous and unimportant points of resemblance between the several races of man in bodily structure and mental faculties. And the parentheses here is the important one. I do not here refer to similar customs, should all have been independently acquired. So this is a very modern distinction. We don't think that the genetic differences between human populations are very significant at all. In fact, total human genetic diversity is rather low compared to chimpanzees, for example. So we have anomalously low genetic diversity, although some interesting genetic diversity to be sure. But the bulk of the differences between human populations are customs, not genes. In other words, the cultural variation is much more important source of variation between groups than genes. And but in spite of his suspicion of progress, he did have this theory of moral progress, which Robert Richards made much of. And the core of it is he made a distinction between primordial times and civilized times. In primordial times, natural selection on organic characters was important. This is a little passage here that describes his tribal group selection hypothesis. That he argues that this high standard of morality gives slight or no advantage to each individual in the same tribe, but the number of well-endowed men and an advancement of the standard of morality will give an immense advantage of one tribe over another. A tribe including many members who, from possessing a high degree, the spirit of patriotism, fidelity, obedience, courage, and sympathy, were always ready to aid one another and sacrifice themselves for the common good, would be victorious over most other tribes. And this would be natural selection. So that is, in primordial times, we got these, what I think of as pro-social emotions: patriotism, courage, obedience, sympathy, and so on. And then in highly civilized times, continued progress depends in a subordinate degree on natural selection. The more efficient causes of progress seem to consist of a good education in youth while the brain is impressible, a high standard of excellence inculcated by the ablest and best man, embodied in laws, customs, and traditions of the nation enforced by public opinion. So this is a quote that I think could be put in the mouths of almost every progressive that is active today. That below there's the quote from Martin Luther King about the arc of the moral universe bending towards justice. So the second part of this talk, I want to try to understand how Darwin's influence on the emerging social sciences almost disappears. So around the turn of the 20th century, the modern social science disciplines and human biology, as far as that's concerned, began to be professionalized, and the disciplines came to take on a pronounced institutional flavor with departments of sociology and psychology and so on being established at universities. And so by the late 19th century, there were at least two important figures that were explicitly Darwinian in their approach to the social sciences. James Mark Baldwin and Thorstein Veblen were prominent Darwinians in the 1890s. And Jeff has written the textbook on what happened to Veblen's evolutionary institutionalism and how it didn't get incorporated into the institutional economics in the United States, and his influence therefore was not felt at the critical time when the discipline of economics was being established. Baldwin's evolutionary approach to psychology likewise didn't make it into mainstream psychology for similar reasons. Both of these guys' careers were cut short by scandal, and their influence was sort of artificially diminished by that. And about the same time, Spencerian progressivism became the dominant evolutionary thread in the social sciences. Carniero is a modern Spencerian who's written about this. So in Darwin's time, there were two sort of generic pictures of evolution. The one on the right here is the progressivist picture, that there's a sort of a conifer-like pattern of evolution of ever greater complexity and sophistication of organisms, culminating in modern humans. And then there are side branches that where you can imagine that natural selection has adapted organisms at all these levels to specific environments in the via evolution by natural selection. And the other picture, the more Darwinian picture, is that it's not a tree, it's a bush, and that there's no higher and lower, although Darwin used higher and lower races quite freely, part of his truckling, I imagine. So that these two pictures of evolution are quite different, and there are various ways to try to put them together. In other words, imagining that the side branches here are due to natural evolution by natural selection, but the main trend of evolution is some kind of progressive principle. So Spencer had the idea that there was an inherent tendency in biology for simple organisms to become more complicated, more differentiated, more integrated. To be fair, there are lots of monotonic trends in evolutionary history, so that these ideas are not don't exist in an empirical vacuum. There's something that has to be taken into account in many cases of progressive trends. It isn't all just bushiness. So by the time the social sciences are gelling, the Spencerian ideas of evolution were dominant. Okay. So I want to talk briefly about anthropology, because it in some ways is an interesting case of missed opportunities in my estimation, at least. So the founder of anthropology in the United States, or at least the most influential figure, was Franz Boas, a German who is generally not thought of as an evolutionist at all. But it turns out he was a quite committed Darwinian. This fellow Lewis, I only ran across this in the last couple of 3 years. I hadn't appreciated this at all before. So Boas appreciated Darwin's particularism. In other words, in Darwin's theory, every species is evolving on its own, right? They're evolving adaptations to local environments. Each species on its own footing, and the Boasian approach to anthropology was similar. He and his followers and were interested in cultural diversity. They were interested in why the different people in different cultures did all these wild and wonderful things that were documented by Boas and his successors. So he was thinking that cultures, like species, have their own unique histories, and that they are therefore evolving on their own, so to speak. And there's an unpublished lecture that Lewis dredged up from probably around 1909, a 50th anniversary celebration of the origin of species, in which Boas expressed his admiration for Darwin and explained the reasons for it. Boas also introduced from Germany, where this concept apparently was common, the four fields concept of anthropology. He and his followers established a bunch of anthropology departments in the U.S. And they included four different subfields: sociocultural anthropology, biological anthropology, archaeology, and linguistics. And to this day, many departments of anthropology in the United States, not so much in Britain and elsewhere, but in the United States, follow this four fields concept. And so the idea that biological anthropology, organic evolution, was part of of anthropology was established firmly in the United States. Oops, dang it. I'm not being disciplined about how I changed slides here. So heirs of Spencer, like Leslie White, tarred particularism, as they called it, as unscientific. Leslie White called Boas's philosophy of planless hodgepodgeism, and he wanted physical laws, physical style laws, like the laws of gravity. And his own nomination for this was the increased energy consumption per capita, that there was some progressive principle that caused people to develop increasing energy consumption per capita. Now, this is not a crazy idea, because at least the Holocene history of human societies just includes increasing use of energy per capita. So vestiges of this kind of Darwinian evolutionism were maintained by Kroeber, Stewart, Julian Stewart, one of his followers, Clyde Clucko, and another Kroeberian student of Kroeber's, I believe, Margaret Mead, but there was no sustained program. And so why didn't biological anthropology keep up with developments in evolutionary biology? In fact, they didn't, for whatever reason. There was little contact maintained between evolutionary biology and biological anthropology. When I was a student at Berkeley, I took a course in biological anthropology from a guy named Sherwood Washburn, who was a quite prominent biological anthropologist in his day. And that was one of his missions, was to try to bring evolutionary biology back into biological anthropology, a endeavor in which he by and large failed until quite recently. So biological anthropology became largely descriptive stones and bones work. Richard Klein, biological anthropologist at Stanford, wrote a book called The Human Career, which is 2 or 3 editions of it. It's a dictionary-sized tome of descriptive work on the stones and bones. It is arranged in chronological order and sort of emphasizes this progressive nature of human evolution. But there's no theory, no attempt to tie this to evolutionary biology. So when Robin Boyd, my longtime colleague, and Joan Silk, his wife, in the late 1990s, I think, wrote the first edition of their textbook in biological anthropology. They just deliberately did this because the textbooks available at the time were so atheoretical and didn't incorporate evolutionary biology. So they wrote that textbook. And by now, my brief little survey, almost all of the biological anthropology textbooks today have followed their lead in that regard. So just to emphasize that there was this undercurrent. Kroeber's textbook talked about cultural evolution, contrasted it with organic evolution. The Cultural Evolution Society's logo is based upon a picture of an illustration in Kroeber's textbook, which has these anastomosing branches that where the branches, there are cross branches that carry culture from one society to another. That contrasts with at least good species where the species are isolated genetically from other species. And Margaret Mead, a Boasian anthropologist, a famous one, late in her career wrote a book on cultural evolution in keeping with this almost underground trend. In other words, they acknowledge the idea that culture is something that evolved, but there was no program, a sustained program of work. And that's what left a lot of work for cultural evolutionists to do in the starting in the latter part of the 20th century. A trio of very prominent social scientists, Gerard Cluckhone and Rappaport, the game theorist, Clyde Cluckhone, anthropologist. Robert Gerard was a psychologist, and they were in the first meeting of the Stanford Institute for the Advanced Study in the Social Sciences in 1955, probably, and wrote a very sophisticated paper that was hardly cited at all until we all discovered it and started citing it in the 70s and 80s. Don Campbell started a sustained program of studies in cultural evolution. He applied it especially to scientific discovery and the evolution of science. His evolutionary epistemology ideas were influential. And then Richard Alexander and E.O. Wilson focused evolutionary biologists' attention on human behavior in the mid-70s, and Cavalli, Sforza, and Feldman introduced population genetics methods in a couple papers in 73 and in their influential 81 book. Rob and I attempted an evolutionary functional analysis of culture in our 85 book. And from the 90s onward, there's been pretty rapid growth in the field. But it's still not the dominant theoretical foundation for the human sciences the way it is in biology. Okay, thanks to Brian for inviting me, and thanks to all of you for your attention, and let's have a discussion.
Thanks very much, Peter. Anyone like to come in with a question or a contribution? Sure. Marion, please. Marion?
Yes, one thing that always struck me about Darwin and his understanding of evolution relative to humans is in several places he acknowledged the knowledge about the history of human languages. And the Indo-European language family was known at the time, and he used that as an example to try and help explain what he was getting at in biology. And I wondered oftentimes if he used it for his own thinking too, if it helped him understand what he was doing in terms of common descent and so on. But he certainly recognized.
And Max Muller, the historical linguist, was also aware of the parallels with organic evolution. So yeah, I think of historical linguistics in the mid-19th century was far more sophisticated than evolutionary biology, really. It was the premier evolutionary science of its time, which is kind of ironic in a way. So yeah, I think both the well, Darwin certainly appreciated the work of the historical linguists and exemplified the parallels and differences between cultural and organic evolution. Of course, given that he thought that there was the inheritance of acquired variation, it's not, he's made genes or organic inheritance less distinctive than compared to cultural evolution than otherwise turns out to be true.
It's still just interesting to think that maybe the analogy went from culture to biology originally rather than biology to culture eventually.
Yeah, well, I think you could make a case, as I say, that the linguists were more sophisticated than the biologists in terms of their understanding of evolution, and it's still true today that the historical linguists and others, experimental linguists, have done some really neat work on just exactly how language does evolve. The sociolinguist
Chilburn,
LeBoeuf.
You'd like to come in?
Yes, sure. Thanks a lot for this talk. I have a question, Pete, regarding, let's say, the underpinning of anthropology, especially cultural anthropology, namely verbal theory, as opposed to mathematical theory. And my point is simply that verbal theory travels less easily across generations than does mathematical theory. And there's, with respect to the story you're telling here and all these endings, good beginnings that ended in the sand. There's another stream that started with, let's say, Mendel, Locke, Volterra, Sewell Wright, Fisher, and goes on, to Hamilton, Maynard Smith, and so on. And this mathematical foundation, to some extent, created a stronger vehicle for evolutionary theory to travel. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think that's right. Evolution is a kind of exhibits a kind of complexity that can only be dealt with mathematics. You need the mathematics to school your intuition, and once you get those mathematical models in your head, it's hard to lose the insight that you get from them because they're quite concrete in a certain sense. But now that can also be misleading. People can fall in love with their models, including the flaws in the models. And you have to watch that. But I think, yes, that the failure of biological anthropology to pick up on the mathematical thread, the population genetics thread, is part of the reason why, in spite of having a biological anthropology subdepartment in most American university anthropology departments, the evolution just didn't get into the heads of even the biological anthropologists themselves in the sense, as you say, of population genetics and ecological theory that you mentioned, the headline stars of that thread in population biology, they like to call themselves nowadays.
Thank you.
I've got a question, Peter. In my work in a similar area, I'm looking from the point of view of economics and to some degree sociology as well. My impression is that there's a sort of gap where Darwin drops out of significance. I mean, even in biology, it took as you said, it took the synthesis with Mendelian genetics to get Darwinism really going towards the middle of the 30s and 40s, the middle of the 20th century. But the period from about the First World War to after the Second World War, shortly afterwards, there was a reaction, a very, very strong reaction in sociology in particular, and also in other disciplines like psychology to a degree, and philosophy also changed in various ways, to reject evolutionary thinking as such. And take Talcott Parsons, for example. So Parsons was originally linked with the American institutionalists, Veblen et al., and then he reacts against it. And part of his ambition, part of his reason for doing this is he didn't like the early American sociologists, many of whom talked about Darwinism, like Lester Frank Ward, and others, but some of which were quite racist in their views, like Ross and others. And for various reasons which are not entirely clear, Parsons wanted to get rid of these guys. And he wanted to build modern sociology on largely Marx, Weber, Durkheim, and he played a crucial role in bringing Weber's work to the attention of American scholars in particular. He was largely successful in that, but in fact, ironically, Parsons retreats and starts talking about evolution himself in the 40s and 50s in a kind of particular way. But there's this period of several decades from the First World War till after the Second World War, when it's really quite unpopular in lots of disciplines to discuss evolutionary ideas. Schumpeter writes about this. He says, "Oh, we can't talk about it." Yes, this is Schumpeter, who's hallowed as an evolutionary economist. He says, "We don't want any of this talk about biological evolution. What we mean is just development." Do you get the same view from your area, your line of your viewpoint about this crucial period, interwar period, where Darwinism was really kind of unpopular in the social sciences?
Yeah, well, but the irony is that social Darwinism was mainly Spencerian, not Darwinian in its inspiration. And
I would disagree with that, if I may interrupt, Peter. Spencer was not described as a social Darwinian until 1937. There was a crucial period in the 30s when social Darwinism, which was virtually extinct as a term, was reconstructed by people like Richard Hofstadter to mean anti-individualism. And Spencer then became part of the story, but before then, Spencer was not called a social Darwinist.
But did any of the sociologists that you're referring to, were they Darwinists in the sense that Boas was a Darwinist?
Well, they wouldn't admit to it. I mean, Parsons declared early 30s that it's also in his book on 1937 book on structure and social action. He declared there that sociology should have nothing to do with evolutionary thinking, including Darwinian thinking. I mean, as I said, he rescinded on that, he backtracked, but very few sociologists, because he was basically reconstructing this field with Marx, Weber, Durkheim at the center of it. And rebuilding it from its different earlier time in the pre-First World War. And so it was really quite unpopular for sociologists until sometime afterwards to even talk about this.
Yeah, I attribute that, maybe I'd be interested in what you think. I attribute a lot of that to the disciplinization that took place around the turn of the century.
Yeah, that's
so
right.
the Gabriel Tard, the French sociologist who built his whole theory around cultural evolution, basically, the war of ideas, the competitive conflict between ideas and the triumph of some ideas over other ideas. It was very much a Darwinian picture, but he was very keen to say that he didn't want any biological influence. He wasn't talking about biology at all. He was talking, and that sociology should rid itself of any influence from biology. This is a period when Darwin became a biologist and not a social scientist, if you want. He became defined as a biologist by these folks, even though his biology was terrible and his social science wasn't bad. So there's an irony there, yes. And Spencer's influence, it seems to me, was large in the social sciences, whether they call themselves social Darwinists or not. So yes, I think I agree. General, you seem to know more about this than I do. I'm a poor student of the history of sociology, I'm afraid.
Thank you, Peter. Well, anyone else like to come in? Jan Willem. Jan Willem?
Yeah, sorry, I just have to connect. I actually have two questions. So one is a little bit more in terms of what you've been discussing so far, which is how these different disciplines developed. So let me start there. The other is a bit more specific. You seem to end, Pete, on saying this whole approach is still not the dominant approach in the social sciences, or as you call it, the human sciences. At the same time, I think many of us would think that it has become much more popular, more visible, maybe a bit spread out. I'm not sure if there's anything integrative, but in different disciplines, there is much more, I think, these days than there was 50 years ago when you guys picked up on this in your storyline. So basically, my question is, if you look a little bit at the more recent history and where we are today, in light of your comment at the end that it's not still what I suppose what you mean to say is that it's not still what it could or should be. Well, what is your view on that? What would we need to do in order to make it more central?
Well, who was it that said science progresses one funeral at a time?
Max
I mean,
Planck.
there is a excuse me,
Planck.
Max Planck. Well, I think that there is a generational timescale involved, and so the history will just have to develop, and it's according to its own timescale. But yes, I mean, I'm really pleased with the Cultural Evolution Society and all the impact that we have had. It's certainly not negligible, for sure, and one can imagine, at least I think, evolution should be for humans, people in the human sciences, social sciences, really most particularly, just part of the toolkit, right? These are tools that if you have the right kind of problem, they're a good, if maybe the only way to solve certain kinds of problems. I mean, I was a practicing ecologist for many years, and I had pretty good training in evolutionary biology, but I never used any evolutionary tools in my ecology. We had this idea that there's a separation of timescales, and there's an ecological timescale, 1 to a few generations, the evolutionary timescale, many generations, and as long as you stuck to ecological problems, you didn't need evolutionary tools. Well, modern ecologists and evolutionary biologists have made light of that distinction, and many population biologists, as they like to call themselves nowadays, would just deny that that separation of timescales is real. Now, I agree that it's not real, but it's sometimes convenient convenient way to think about problems on different timescales. But that's neither here nor there. So it would seem to me that, I mean, if I were designing the curriculum for budding social science students, I'd reform it on the same way that the curriculum for biologists was being reformed when I was an undergraduate and fresh early graduate student. The old disciplinary boundaries were dissolved. We were encouraged to take calculus and chemistry and physics in our first year. There was a sort of an ideology of the unity of the natural sciences, and that disciplinary boundaries in the natural sciences became very soft. I mean, areas of research like biochemistry became very, very influential because there were a lot of problems that in biology that were basically could use the techniques and concepts and mathematical models from chemistry to solve biological problems, and that sort of thing became rife. And and the Cultural Evolution Society is kind of devoted to that kind of philosophy with regard to the human sciences.
Just to follow up on that, where would you, in your own opinion, where would you say that the Cultural Evolution Society has been most influential within the social sciences? Because is it being picked up by sociologists, or because I don't. I mean, there is people like us who are. I'm in business. Jeff is in economics, and we have overlap. Of course, business and economics have overlap. And of course, we're aware of what happens there, and we would like our fields to pick up more of that. But where is the impact mostly in anthropology, would you say, from the Cultural Evolution Society, or is there some impact in sociology? Or
well, I think that people in anthropology departments, many anthropology departments, ours here on campus, Davis campus is one. It's divided into the evolutionary wing and a sociocultural wing. So the archaeologists and the biological anthropologists are all evolutionary, and some of the people, my now retired colleague Monique Borgerhoff Mulder was trained as a sociocultural anthropologist and certainly was never trained as a biologist. She picked up her evolution in her postgraduate work. And so she, to my way of thinking, was just a cultural anthropologist, but one infused with evolutionary biology, which put her in the evolutionary wing, not the sociocultural wing. So, and I was an officer. I was the president of the Evolutionary Anthropology Society, which is a sub-society of the American Anthropology Society. So for the my term as president, I went to all of the AAA meetings, and they are from the evolutionary point of view. There's a few evolutionary anthropologists and a great unwashed mass of postmodernist style sociocultural anthropologists. So I would go to sit in on some of their sessions just to get the flavor of the thing. But it was so our influence in anthropology is sound, but it's still quite a minority, and the standard sociocultural anthropologists are basically humanists. They're don't even pretend to be scientists any longer.
You're saying exactly what Alan Page Fiske once told me. He says cultural anthropologists have given up on doing science. But so I'm taking away from what you're saying. I mean, we don't teach social science as such, right? I mean, students cannot, well, maybe in some universities they can go in and study social science, but they study either sociology or anthropology, and most of them will then do cultural anthropology, which is maybe non-scientific, or they do economics, or they do psychology. Yeah, anyway, so maybe there is something about its disciplinarity that is in the way of this thing
so I
being
think
what it could be.
Yeah, I very much think that's the case. As I say, in my youth, the natural science disciplines were softening their disciplinary boundaries hugely.
So that's where we should go.
And I think that's the way the the social sciences need to go to.
Yeah.
Now, how to accomplish that, aside from, as I say, I think those people who are interested in evolution have drunk that Kool-Aid, but the great mass of anthropologists certainly hasn't. And who knows what the future history of anthropology will be like, or sociology, which I think is broadly similar, but I don't know for sure. Economics.
Sorry, Marion's got a hand up. Come back
Yeah,
again.
but I'll save my other question for later, maybe. Yeah, thanks.
Okay, that'd be great. Yeah. Marion?
Oh, I was just going to say, going back to the historical question for a minute, surely it was rejected because it was implicitly assumed they weren't clearly thinking about the distinction between biological and sociocultural, but they were assuming it was racist, and they were rejecting racism by rejecting evolutionism. That's really what was going on.
Yeah.
As far as jumping up to the modern times, I don't know whether you're knowledgeable or about interested in, but the population genetics model has been undergoing attack, not just for culture, but in biology. There's a lot of things going on about the need for a new or extended evolutionary synthesis that incorporates development as well as ecology, and it's not just about genetics and evolution and so on and so on. And there's a new book out, I think a really, really important book. It was first written by a group of evolutionists and developmentalists together, and Kevin Lalonde, or Lala, as he calls himself these days, the first author. But Mark Feldman is on the authors list. And, how is evolution how is evolution evolving or something? It's really important book. It's going to get a lot of discussion because this discussion has been going on for quite a while, for about 20 or 25 years, but it hasn't focused down on one thing. And I think it's going to focus down on that book.
Yeah, Kevin's an old and dear friend of mine, and so I've been present at the birth of all of that stuff. And
that's interesting.
And Rob's and my attitude for a long time was that humans were an exception, that the modern synthesis was good enough for the rest of the natural world, but humans had these the secondary system of inheritance, which was so important in our evolution. And so we were prepared to sort of meet the modern synthesis halfway and say, well, yeah, humans are kind of a screwy exception, but the rest of biology you can have. This was our way of, I guess, truckling to the trying to stay out of trouble with the evolutionary biologists. But gradually, I've become convinced that Kevin and Eva Jablonka and there's a whole group of people that I've talked to over the years, Russell Gray, that have endorsed this extended evolutionary synthesis idea. And I think that, let's take social learning, protoculture, culture, and other species besides humans. Back in the day, a fellow named Jeff Galiff, he's a fellow Canadian, you might know him, Marion. Jeff worked on social transmission of food preferences in Norway rats, and he did a wonderful body of work on this. But he tended to think that Norway rat social learning was social learning in other animals, that this was a model of social learning. And it was, it was important to Norway rats, but you could also make models that suggested that social learning would arise in a sort of a semi-parasitic way, and that you could imagine that culture was just not very important. And insofar as it was important, it was under strong control of genetic preferences. And again, the Norway rat system would answer to that analysis. But the importance of the scope and importance of social learning in non-human animals has been demonstrated to my satisfaction quite well. So Andy Whiten, for example, has written a couple of influential papers arguing that social learning is much more important in lots of animal species than we originally thought, and I think that's true. So I think the case for an extended evolutionary synthesis is strong, much stronger than I would have thought 20 or 25 years ago. I mean, I argued with Kevin and John Odling Smay is another good friend of mine. I argued with them about niche construction and until they browbeat me into shutting up anyway. But yeah, they made the case. I agree.
Okay, well, I would just,
you had a second question, yeah?
I guess I would think that we're not thinking about it far enough. I think you're thinking about it, okay, biological evolution, and it has to be modified with cultural evolution. But what these people are thinking is biological evolution has to be modified in these ways. And it may be the case, therefore, that cultural evolution idea has to be modified in similar ways. Do you understand what I mean? It's not just a matter of bringing the two together. It's that they're changing fundamentally ideas about biological evolution. And we maybe need to change fundamentally the ideas about cultural evolution in a similar way or similar ways.
Well, yes, that's quite correct. The more general idea of the extended evolutionary synthesis is that the developmental processes play a strong role in evolution, and that the modern synthesis distinction, Ernst Mayr's distinction between proximate and ultimate causes is not nearly as rigid as he portrayed it. That proximal causes can infiltrate evolution and ultimate causes, and culture is just one example of that. So ordinary mechanisms of phenotypic flexibility like learning and so on can have developmental consequences that can play a role in evolutionary processes. That's the broader issue, and I certainly think it's true. Now, in the case of cultural evolution, I think we've taken the developmental thing on board. I mean, one of the first things I read back when I got interested in this was child development textbooks on how children learn socially and things like that. So I think that the developmental thread is much more firmly grafted into the thinking on cultural evolution than it was when the biologists were making that rigid distinction between proximate and ultimate causation. They need to take the developmental processes more seriously than as we always have. Would be the case I'd make to you.
I understand that. I think that's interesting. I think it's in a different way somewhat though, but that's a topic for another day. Thank you.
Thank you both. Jan Willem had a second question, I understand. Do you want to come in with that, Jan Willem?
Yeah, if there's nobody else that has a hand up, but
Yeah.
it's gonna take things in a slightly different direction. So I also didn't want to sort of take away from the ongoing discussion. Now, Pete, I a couple of months ago I read a book by a guy that I suppose is or was a colleague of yours, Dutch by origin, Gerard Vermeij.
Oh, yeah. Jerry Vermeij. We mangle it as Jerry Vermeij.
Yeah, that's why it's always difficult to pronounce as being Dutch a Dutch name to other people, because it doesn't sound like you would even recognize. But this is the book,
right?
and I was you had one thing, one slide there about the Bushiness or the so one theme is this: are things progressive or not, and how should we look at that? I was reading this with quite a lot of interest. It's the first thing I read by him. It seems
I
to
confess
make
I haven't read it.
you haven't read it?
No.
No, but yeah, what he seems to make is a case for evolution. So basically, the title is The Evolution of Power, and then the subtitle is a new understanding of the history of life. And what he seems to make is rather a progressive argument, in the sense that evolution is about progression after all, which is sort of, I found quite interesting as sort of the main message here. And then the idea would be that we can think of evolution as having a long-term trajectory towards more power. And he defines, I'm not sure if he defines it specifically enough. That is maybe a little bit nebulous about what power exactly is. Maybe it's too many things at the same time. But there's basically an idea there that there is some sort of a vector in evolution where over time it's an evolution towards more power, where power seems to mean something like being able to have a freedom of, you can do more, your freedom, you have more freedom of behavior, which more or less correlates with how many resources you can basically muster, if you will. There's some sort of an argument there. So to me, it was quite surprising that somebody who's basically a biologist would be daring enough to make a case for a progressive view of evolution. So I don't know if you have anything to say about it, but there was a theme like that also in your talk.
Yeah. So one of my interests these days is macroevolution, specifically human macroevolution, but more generally, I've been interested in macroevolution ever since I was a graduate student, took a course from a paleontologist that was the most sophisticated course in evolution I took as a student by a guy named James Valentine. The question is, to me, is what kind of mechanism do you think drives these trends? So there is a broad trend in evolution toward organisms generating more power, more work per unit time or per unit biological, per kilogram of organism. And but the question is, what does that owe to? And a great part of it owes to the geochemical evolution of the Earth. That, in other words, for billions of years, the amount of oxygen in the ocean and in the atmosphere was so low that the only kinds of organisms that could live were prokaryotes, bacteria and archaea that can generate relatively, their metabolism is quite slow. The amount of energy per gram of bacteria per hour is much lower than we generate in our own bodies. And then when oxygen became, small amounts of oxygen became available, then we got eukaryotic organisms, and usually small wormy things that had mitochondria. So the mitochondria are these energy producing organelles in our cells that up the amount of energy that we can process hugely. Now, and then in the Cambrian or so, oxygen became sufficiently abundant that large organisms, large-bodied organisms, could exist. We could have hearts and lungs and gills that could absorb oxygen and distribute it around the body. And this is very energy intensive stuff. So even today, cold-blooded animals process something like a tenth the energy that warm-blooded animals do. So we're warm-blooded animals are really wasteful if you want to think of it that way. But I can kill a rattlesnake, and a rattlesnake has a devil's own time killing me. So that's another form of power, I guess. So that sort of trend exists, but what causes it? Is it external forces like the geochemical evolution of the Earth, or is it internal processes, progress in a Spencerian sort of a Spencer had this motor that basically sounds like the second law of thermodynamics backwards that generated progress in his scheme. Those are macroevolutionists think of those as internalist processes. So that even if there are these trends, and there certainly are trends, then the explanation for those trends is still up in the air.
Okay, can I ask Kevin? You've had your hand up for a while. Kevin?
Sure. Hey, Peter. Great to see you.
Hi there.
Been a while.
Hi, Kevin.
Hi. So Brian Smith recommended I graduate from the chat and bring over into the conversation here what I put into the chat. So I've been working with some economists, and we have among other products, a working paper. It's on. I put the link in the chat. And long story short, there's a main effect of interdisciplinarity that's negative on individuals' careers. At least we have a sample of several 100,000 doctoral graduates across all fields in the US. 2008, 2016 is our sample. And we are only looking at the first year after the PhD. So those are some of the limitations, and that's the scope of the sample. Yeah. But maybe more interesting than the main effect is there's a lot of variance across fields. And that's actually where we're at right now in the revising process for that paper. So I'd be curious of your thoughts. The figure 3 that is visible in the link, it shows some patterns across some of the top level fields. One of the patterns that kind of seems clear is that higher paying fields might be more inclined to guard their boundaries or engage in status enclosures. Sociologists would call it that. But there's another dimension that we're actively analyzing, which you might have special thoughts on, which is the mathiness of different fields. So anthropology, which can mean so many different things, is in the social sciences in that figure. And it's one of the areas that does penalize people for painting outside the lines. But there are some lower paying fields that do reward people for painting outside the lines. And anyway, I'll know in a week, basically. But one of the hypotheses we're exploring is maybe math or mathiness is one of the predictors of rewarding or not penalizing interdisciplinarians, because math is abstract enough and provides people with optionalities. So sorry for the long setup to that, but I'm just trying to make sense, because you've obviously been very successful with what you've been doing. It's very interdisciplinary, and math seems to have been a common characteristic.
Yeah, I think math is quite portable. Yeah, so I think that one of the things that people are inclined to think is that if you can do math, you can probably be put to useful work somehow. If you can't do math, well, then it's a little iffier. I don't know. That's just off the top of my head. I haven't thought too hard about that. But so one of my completely outside my cultural evolutionary career, I was a limnologist, a freshwater oceanographer, if you want, and I got my tenure working on problems on the intersection of physics and biology in lakes. And so I collaborated with a guy who was his PhD was in particle physics, and he taught himself to be a physical oceanographer, basically. And so we collaborated on this series of papers that got us both tenure. So, and what he brought to the table, as much as anything, was a considerably better math skills than I have. And when I got into cultural evolution, I recruited Rob Boyd. Well, we fell to talking about things, but his math skills were far better than mine. He was also trained as a physicist. His undergraduate degree was in physics, and so yes, I'm a big believer in the utility of mathematics in crossing disciplinary boundaries, because a lot of the kinds of equations, for example, are quite portable. So the coupled differential equations, like the Voltaire equations, if you're an ecologist, you're familiar with those predator-prey and two coupled differential equations. But the people who really know coupled differential equations are I guess, particle physicists or other kinds of physicists that deal in complicated physics problems. And so if you want your students to be trained in a couple differential equations, you send them to some guy in the physics department. At least he's in the physics department in our university, and I think it's quite common. So a number of Sir Robert May, the former science advisor to the British government, was an Australian, trained as a physicist, and made his name in community ecology by using his knowledge of coupled differential equations to speculate about how ecological communities functioned. So it doesn't surprise me. Math is a ticket to skipping to another discipline. I know a lot of people who've succeeded in doing that.
Okay, Marion, can you be very brief, please? Marion? Okay, got your hand up.
Yeah, she's coming.
Would you have anything to say or suggest to many of the people of this group that are economists and who are interested in organizations? If I take, for example, your latest PNASC article, you stop at norms. And I think most sociologists would go one step further, without getting into group selection, would go to social roles or statuses. You know, like lawyers learn to be lawyers from other lawyers, and people of a particular ethnic group learn the language and the culture of that ethnic group, and so on. But what about the people in this group who are primarily interested in organizations? I mean, what it's been kind of taken as from a lot of Jeffrey's work, he goes back to Don Campbell, is that it's really just viability selection, and that's all there is. You know, like McDonald's. I mean, when you get a franchise, you get the right to sell McDonald's hamburgers. You don't get the right to sell McDonald's hamburgers. You know, like, do you have any advice about evolutionism to people who are interested in organizations?
Yeah, well, there's a terminological issue that's troubled me, and here's how I think about it. People talk about norms, and people who talk about norms generally are either psychologists or inspired by psychology, and they are thinking about the rules that are in the head of a given individual. Many other social scientists, sociologists, and many economists think in terms of institutions, which are the society level rules that specify, for example, how the division of labor works and other large scale things. So my solution to this, and many of my colleagues, Rob included, speak quite unreservedly in terms of norms, but to kind of shy away from institutions. And it seems to me that the right way to think about this, or a way to think about it, is that institutions are the society level rules, or at least some large subset of a society. And the norms are the individual level rules. So the norms and the institutions are tied together. That it's the let's just take a classic institution, marriage. So I'm a husband. So I have the norms for husband that are inculcated in males, particularly males who marry, and so the now I may not know all of the norms that apply to wives, for example. I certainly know a bunch of them, because you can't interact with your wife unless you understand what's motivating her. But on the other hand, I don't need to know all of the things that wives know, and she doesn't need to know all the things that husbands know. And this across the broadly across the division of labor, this is going to be true. I know a little bit about lawyers and doctors, but I don't have an intimate knowledge of the norms that drive their professional behavior, and they probably don't have a good idea, only a sort of a generalized idea about what college professors are motivated to do. So that's my solution to that problem. And so we need to talk about both norms and institutions, depending upon the kind of problem we're addressing.
I think on that very interesting point, we have to draw things to an end. I mean, I could go on for at least 5 minutes about the difference between norms, rules, institutions, and organizations, but I mean, that would be boring. I want to thank Peter very, very much for a very stimulating talk. It's great to have you with us, Peter. On behalf of all of us, we're much inspired by your work, and this talk has also been fantastically useful. So thank you very much, and thank you everyone for attending.
Thank you all, and it's been my pleasure. I appreciate your attention.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.